So let's start on the border situation. Canberrans are allowed in now to South Australia. Should the state follow suit with those from New South Wales? I mean, that would be a much bigger boost, for example, for tourism. It's coming into its own now in spring.
Well, I think in all of these cases, it's about managing the risk properly. I think we've done a relatively good job. We have got our borders closed to Victoria. That is appropriate. We've now opened them up to the ACT, and we've signalled that we are looking at opening them up to New South Wales. What beggars belief is on our western side, where the border to Western Australia is shut. We have a situation in South Australia where we have no COVID cases. That's just completely baffling.
Well, it is, isn't it? And we have obviously Mark McGowan there saying borders could be up until next year. As you say, everyone gets why Victoria is shut. Perhaps you can have a debate around New South Wales and appetite for it, but that's something to hammer home, isn't it? South Australia and WA, WA actually has 4 active cases, South Australia 0, and WA has its border up to South Australia.
Yeah, it's just completely at odds with any logic, and that should change. And one of the problems we've got, as you mentioned in your opening, is that we have a national cabinet now that is quite fractured. It's nothing like it was at the peak of COVID. We're returning to federalism. We're seeing the Prime Minister have a go at Labor MPs. We're seeing Labor premiers. We're seeing Labor premiers now pushing back on the Prime Minister. I think we can successfully call the National Cabinet a failure in terms of a long-term prospect.
I should point out we've invited Mark McGowan on the show previously. We'll continue to do so. So why is National Cabinet failing then? Who do you blame?
Well, we can see that it worked well during the height of the pandemic, but now we're going into the tough decisions. Things like the reopening of borders, things like who shares the cost when we're trying to bring Australians back to Australian shores. We're going to see lots and lots of cost cutting now taking place. That organisation is not going to cope, certainly not going to operate in the same manner in which it has during the sort of needs phase dealing with the pandemic. Now all the hard decisions come, and we will not see alignment across the Federation.
What do you mean by cost cutting? That previously very generous response from the federal government, states starting to pitch in as well, but now they'll all be saying, no, you pay for this, you pay for that. That's going to be the new norm at National Cabinet?
Well, that's exactly what's happening today in relation to bringing people back to Australia. We are seeing resistance, the state saying you've got to contribute. And look, I actually think that's a fair proposition. But we're seeing the federal government say no. We're going to have a whole range of issues where we're trying to deal with a huge deficit, and there will be lots and lots of fighting from here on in. It's not going to look like a National Cabinet for very much longer.
Well, as for contributions, though, the federal government's been pointing out a lot of troops on the ground. It has made a very significant contribution to all this, and New South Wales is certainly doing a hell of a lot. So does other states also need to be willing to do more? It's not just on the federal government here.
Well, it's just, if you look at, for example, Victoria having shut down, the big cost burden for that, certainly in real time is in actual fact the Commonwealth government. I think it'll hurt Victoria in the longer term, but there's an example where there is frustration between the state and the federal government.
Just want to ask you finally about the gas focus outlined by the federal government. South Australia is an interesting test case because a huge amount of renewables were put into the grid, and there has been more of a push for more gas there of late to sort of firm them up. Do you agree with the approach? There's a fair bit of debate among scientists as to gas, whether it's this sort of good transition fuel or whether it's another fossil fuel that gets locked in maybe for decades to come.
Well, in actual fact, I've been looking very closely at this being a South Australian senator. Look, I will acknowledge that about 2 times a day, AEMO are intervening in the market because there's not stability, and generally they're ordering gas to turn on. That doesn't mean we have to go down a pathway of encouraging more gas. I accept that gas has its place. What the government should be doing is setting the criteria, and that is we want clean energy, we want affordable energy, and we want reliable energy, and letting the market get on and do what it does best and delivering to those requirements. Having the government select a solution, I think, is problematic. You know, if the federal government really wanted to do something on the gas front, what it would do is reverse the awful situation whereby all of our cheap gas from the Cooper Basin is exported overseas, and we're left paying the heavy prices with the high wellhead prices for fracking and so forth. It's just an odd situation where we let the international market have the cheap gas, and Australian industry and Australian consumers left paying the larger prices.
But is that partly a bit of an historical issue, though, things that have been locked in? I mean, the government is trying to do a lot. It says there's been various pushes, the so-called gas trigger and so on, to make sure gas prices are somewhat reflective here compared to the rest of the world. But then if you get to sort of changing previous contracts and deals, you run into a bit of sovereign risk, don't you?
These problems originated around about 2013 when we signed up to long-term gas contracts, and indeed that was done in some sense blindly. However, the gas companies at the time did commit to making sure that that wouldn't affect our domestic prices. What happened was that they were unable to recover the gas that they thought they were going to recover, and then they drew on the domestic market. So in terms of sovereign risk, it's not sovereign risk in circumstances where the companies originally indicated that it wasn't going to affect the national price, and in fact it has.
Rex Patrick, appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thank you.